another in-car video. This time we're going to be talking about suspension, and in particular a little bit the more advanced aspect of Ackermann and the general layout of the car regarding caster and camber. I'm not going to explain what caster, camber and Ackermann is because I presume you already know that, and there's lots of good videos on that subject. We'll be talking a little bit more in the direction of sort of how does it really translate into what the car does. Of course, it's extremely important to me to have a setup that you can move into both directions, and you're going to need that for a very simple reason that you're driving different racetracks. You may change tire brands, you may even change shock brands or motor or whatever. There's a lot of guys that start out with a pretty simple motor and then they advance to 400, 500, 600 horsepower or even more, and that could actually mean that you have to change like your setup, and a lot of people kind of like don't think about that, but if you have like a standard SR20 or a standard M3 or M50 or whatever, the dynamics of the car are completely different than when you run like a really big motor. We've touched upon that subject a little bit in the Wisefab mod kit video, but it's also kind of important to keep that in mind when you're changing the power of the car. As I said in that video, everybody basically wants to copy paste their missile car, their fun car, their drift week car into an FD style car. That's extremely difficult. So we're going to be talking about a couple things like that. The Ackermann, of course, is for a lot of people still a little bit mysterious. What's often misunderstood is that the Ackermann is basically a curve. So the difference in parallel steering changes throughout the turning of the wheel. It sounds very, very simple, but it's actually the key to understanding the whole setup of Ackermann for a car. So everybody understands if you set up Ackermann differently, the wheels will become more parallel or less parallel or even over parallel, which would be called reverse Ackermann. A lot of people say, well, you never really use reverse Ackermann. Well, that's true, you normally never use that, but there are some instances where you may use it, and we're going to be talking about that as well. So the first thing that's very, very important is the order of things. So if you're doing the setup of a car, you need to start with the start, and it sounds very obvious, but you need to know what the start is, of course. And starting from the start for me means that you determine which wheel and tire and wheel offset combo you're going to run. That's like basically going to be your first thing, because it's also going to determine a little bit the ride height of the car. Now you want to have a car that's reasonably low, of course, because that looks cool and it's good for the center of gravity. But if you look at the suspension geometry of a lot of cars, they actually work way better in drifting when you don't make them like ridiculously low. The stance guys definitely know this too. They just prevail the looks over the function of the car. It's basically a matter of the geometry regarding anti-squat. And anti-squat basically, in short, because we're not going to go too deep into that, basically means the ability of the suspension to turn the power of the car into forward motion instead of pushing the rear of the car down. So if your car squats like crazy, that could mean that that your anti-squat geometry isn't working correctly. It's not always good. A lot of people say, oh, look at that car squat, and of course it's good when it squats, like it's always going to squat when it's doing good suspension labor, but it's like a tightrope, and that's a word that you're going to hear a lot in this video. It's all about the balance, and it's like walking a tightrope. So you're like balancing, and you don't want to go to extremes because the car becomes undrivable, and that's of course not what we want. So you can have a super gnarly setup, but if that setup is hard to approach, you're not really going to be using it. I always say I try to set up the car like you're advancing the setup, so you're falling into the setup, working on the setup like you walk down a road. So you're basically going step by step by step and try to improve the car or to make the car more suitable for the track or make the car more suitable for the motor or your driving style. So you want to have a car that's basically very scalable in that setup. That's also something that's going to get more and more difficult when the car becomes more powerful. I had a conversation with somebody last week, and we made the analogy of instead of driving down a road to do the setup, it's trying to land on an aircraft carrier. So you're not really like gradually changing your setup into the acceptable or the perfect setup. You start from here, which is not good, and you need to end up there, and you can't really work towards that in little steps. And that's a typical thing with pro cars. So that's why pro cars are so difficult to set up, because it's very, very hard to make them extremely fast and extremely compatible, but to also make them approachable and scalable and easy to get used to and easy to change. That's like basically the holy grail. All the guys that do Formula Drift and race car suspension, it doesn't matter if it's off-road or whatever, they want to have a car that's scalable. So if something happens, they want to be able to turn it up or to turn it down a little bit. Like for instance on Drift Week, the tracks are basically the same, and my car is very, very simple. It's very easy, straightforward car to drive. It's very good balance, but still we are making changes. Like one of the most notable changes that a lot of people actually also said online, said like, hey, your car looks different, is when we drove Willow Springs Horse Thief Mile. That was the first track of Drift Week 4, and what I did there was stiffen up the front of the car and change the toe setting of the car to make sure that it makes it to the next corner. So Willow Springs Horse Thief Mile has a little more distance between the corners, and if you have a low power car, you still need to make it from one corner to the other without munching or without doing weird stuff, and preferably with a little bit of angle. So if you stiffen up the front, you're going to get a little bit more slip angle, and you're basically also playing around with the toe settings of the car to make that happen. And people saw the videos of the car and said like, hey, your car looks different on Willow Springs Horse Thief. And I'm like, yeah, that's true, because we made some changes. We made some changes to the rear, we made some changes to the front suspension. It's a tightrope, so any change that you're going to do on the rear suspension is also going to affect the front. And for instance, on that track, it worked really, really well to stiffen up the front like a lot. So it kind of like skates and basically covers more ground when you're drifting. It also has a couple downsides, of course. You're going to have a little less control when something happens in front of you. It's going to be a little more like dancing on ice when you're flicking the car in. So normally I have my front shocks about 25% off of hard. So let's say 75% hard. And for the road driving on Drift Week, I put them on full soft or Cadillac mode, as Audi calls it. But if I stiffen up that car completely, and I can of course do that with a couple things. I can do that with tire pressure. I can do that with the shock settings. Then that car is going to travel a lot more. It's going to cover more ground. But if I give it like a really insane flick on some tracks, like you need to give it really hard flicks, like Medford, but also a track like Musselman, you really need to flick it in hard. You need to be very dedicated to it. And not like be half-assed, because if you're not dedicated enough, committed enough, then the car is basically going to understeer and it's going to hit the wall, or it's going to go off track, which is of course often seen at Apple Valley. Apple Valley is nice for analyzing, because there's a lot of different guys driving there, like guys that have never driven before, but also Formula Drift drivers. So it's really cool to look at Apple Valley Speedway images. You can really learn a lot from that stuff. But my point is, like, if you're doing an entry that requires you to be super committed, super aggressive, then you want to have a little bit of grip in that front axle just to make sure that the car works. And it also happens, of course, that you're standing in line and your front tires are cooling off a little bit and somebody crashes and you're still waiting. So make sure that you don't run that front too hard, because you're going to be taking risks with the turn-in of the car. I'm really happy that my car was in the middle setting when we went to Horse Thief Mile, because I could still stiffen up the car. and solve the problem of linking that track with a low-powered car. That way, it's a pretty heavy car. It's still reasonably low-powered. I run the Felinos, which are still pretty grippy tires. I run them on around 40 to 45 psi, so it's not ridiculously hard because I don't like cars that are not gripped up at all, especially on drift week type of deals, because you drive a lot. Like, you drive so many laps, you drive way more laps than any competition. You drive probably more laps on drift week than in a whole season of pro or pro-am drifting. So there's also going to be incidents. There's also going to be guys spinning out in front of you, issues happening, whatever. So the camera's a little shaky. Sorry, guys. It's like a bad road I'm driving on. So it's basically compacting 4 or 5 seasons of driving into one. And you know, if you're driving 4 or 5 seasons, things go wrong, you need to correct, or whatever happens. Like, there could be a dog running down the track or whatever. Like, it happens every once in a while. And because drift week is so much driving, anything happens in drift week. So I want to have a little bit of grip in the car, a little bit more than I would basically run in a pro car that's basically only doing pro events, just so I have some ammo to deal with those problems. So long story short, we stiffen up the front. I changed the toe a little bit for horse thief mile, and I was really happy that the car was still operating the way I wanted to. So I can go both ways. If it's a really tight technical track, like some of the tracks that we've done on Drift Week, like Medford on Drift Week 3, extremely tight technical track. The last part of Medford is very, very tight. So you're basically, you almost get, or like Apple Valley, like the second part of Apple Valley is like left, right, left, right, left, right. If you have a passenger, you can see their head bobbing left, right, all the time, because it's such short corners, really following up on each other fast. So I like the front of the car to have a little bit more grip over there, because you don't have to reach for the next corner, because the corners just come up maybe even too fast for your own liking. Like, I'm not really crazy about tracks that are that tight. Maybe with a super light E36, but like with a standard weight E46 M3 or a pro car, it's pretty tight. But Medford's great because it also has some sections where you do have to reach. It has some sections where you have to extend on the handbrake, or it's very technical. But like the second part, like the last 20-30% of Medford and the last 20-30% of AVS is super tight. So I want the front of the car to grip up a little bit over there, so also that it rotates around itself. So that's 2 examples of tracks where you want to have somewhere to go with your setup. So that's extremely important. So what we basically want is a car that works really well with the shock settings and the alignment settings in the middle section. So if you have a car that only works when you put things to extreme, when you completely stiffen up the shocks, or you completely loosen the shocks, you drop the sway bar if you have any, then it basically means that you're using it as a band-aid for a different problem. So it's important, like if you're saying like, hey, we're doing this in this track, I really like that track, it suits the car perfectly, the gearing, everything is great, that's where your car should be in the middle setting. So you should be able to go both ways. So let's say if you have a pro car, it's going to be way easier to link a track like Horse Thief Mile. So that's when things become difficult. So in my M3, I would say, hey, stiffen up the front, isn't that? It's a low-powered car. But if you have a Corvette, it's basically fire and forget, because the car is basically going to propel itself forward to the next corner anyways. So you could basically say like, hey, I don't need to do that. I don't need to stiffen up the front to make it to the next corner with that Corvette. So it's kind of funny. Also really important, of course, in that aspect is Ackermann. So the Ackermann on most Wisefab kits is adjustable, and people say like, hey, what's the perfect Ackermann for this track, or what's the perfect Ackermann for that track? And hey, Wout, you drove Seattle, what Ackermann do you think I should run there? That's of course very difficult, and the reason why is because Ackermann is a curve. So the more you steer, the more you turn the wheel, the more the Ackermann changes, or not, because that's like the setup part of it. So what you basically want to do, if you want to get it right, is find out what angle you're running, what angle really works. So I'm turning this wheel of this car right now into a corner. What you basically want to see is, hey, which part of the track am I getting gapped by other drivers or whatever, and that part of the track is where you want to work on getting your Ackermann perfect. Like I said, on pro cars it becomes a little bit more difficult, because you usually need to make a choice, because those cars are so fast. You're basically always going to end up sacrificing one part of the track to get the car perfect on the other part of the track. In FD, that would probably be the bank, because if you have a really sick bank run and you're chasing really close on the bank and whatever, it's definitely something that the judges like. So you want to work on getting that Ackermann curve perfect for running that bank. So you want to find out what angle is that car doing at the bank and what Ackermann am I doing at that angle. So there's also a lot of personal preference, and there's also cases where you don't really have to adjust the Ackermann, but you can also work with the toe, because Ackermann in a way basically is the toe of the car under lock. It's a little bit too easy to say, but the things that would apply to a toe setting for driving straight will also in a way apply to Ackermann. So if you look at it that way, if I'm driving like Horse Thief Mile, and I'm like, hey, I'm struggling to get from one corner to another, you could make sure that you have less Ackermann effect. So you kind of like find out like, hey, how far am I turning the wheel? Is this like a high angle corner? Is this a low angle corner? Or am I on low angle? Would I want to do a little bit more angle? Those are all indicators that that you could work. So let's say if you drive a car and you feel like, hey, I feel like I could do way more angle, or I do way more angle at different tracks at similar corner, but on this track it doesn't work. Like, you could solve that with Ackermann, because it could very well be that the car is basically working against itself because you're doing a certain amount of angle, and if you would make a little more angle, then the wheels become parallel, and that's of course when you're running very, very corrected Ackermann, and that's where we're coming back to the fact where I said the reverse Ackermann effect. It's often mentioned as a way to keep cars on the bank. So if you have a car that's kind of want to drop down from the bank, so you're high revs in fourth, and the car starts dropping down, and you're like, hey, I can't keep it up on the bank. If you reverse the Ackermann a little bit, means that the other wheel is also going to help keep the car on that bank. So that's like one of the most obvious examples of where you want to run reverse Ackermann. A bank track where you need both the front wheels to keep the nose up, and if you have a pro car and you have enough power to make those wheels rotate, then there's no problem at all to stay on the bank if your front axle is also participating. Another a lot less heard example of running reverse Ackermann is where you're going to need parallel Ackermann sooner in your angle curve. So let's say that you're on a really fast track, and the most important corner, the corner where everybody wins or loses a battle, is very shallow, and you're like struggling with it. You could set up the Ackermann to become reverse Ackermann on higher angle, which is not something that drives really nicely, but because you set it up that way, it's parallel very, very early. So when you're doing maybe 15 degrees of steering, you're already on parallel Ackermann. And the rest of the curve, it's going to suck. You know, you're not going to like that on most tracks. But that's a good example of sacrificing an Ackermann setting for that one part of the track where it's like, hey, either I'm struggling here, I don't know what's going on, I just can't get into my groove, and the rest is kind of easy, the rest of the track is kind of simple. Also, if you're like, hey, this corner is judged like really, really harshly, or the judges say like, this is a super important corner for us, you really want to get the setup of the car perfect for that. So it means that you're basically accepting an Ackermann setting that's not very nice on 40 degrees, but it's parallel on 15 or 20 degrees. And that's why I always say, like, if you set up a pro car to perform perfectly, it's very, very difficult to make it as approachable and as scalable as a Misso car or a Drift Week car or something like that. Of course, the tightrope thing comes into play again. A lot of factors determine things. If you're talking about transition speed, for instance, your toe is going to be very, very important on that because the wheels are basically changing direction. So how soon is that wheel going to bite into the different direction? And you should also understand that the wheels are taking each other's job. So the left wheel is going to be leading at first, and then after transition the right wheel is going to be leading. So at one point they're swapping jobs, so to speak. And your Ackermann and your alignment plays a really big role in that. I wish I could explain how in like 2 or 3 sentences, but it's more, for me, it's like planting a seed, so you actually start thinking about it and playing around with it. you can think about if you run a lot of toe in, it basically makes the car kind of like nervous. So you would think like, hey, it kind of wants to change direction really quickly, but it also means that the wheel is going to take a lot more time before it starts to actually turn in. So think about which weight shift is happening and which wheel is changing operation. If you have a little bit of toe out, the wheels, if you just move the steering wheel a little bit, it's immediately going to start moving into that direction. But how important is that? Because the weight of the car is going to be leaning on the other wheel. So it's also kind of important, how's your shock setup? Is your car heavy? Is your car light? What kind of driver are you? Are you a smooth driver? Are you a driver that's really rowdy, that's really slamming the wheel, like pulling the wheel as hard as you can? So that's going to change the weight transfer, and it's also going to change the weight on the different wheels. So at that point, you may want to work a little. If you're like leaning the car really hard on that other wheel for a transition or for a flick, then you may want to look into what that wheel is doing. So if you're towing out a little bit, then it's going to take that wheel more time to move into the position that you want it to be, or into the position for your next corner. So you really need to think about those things. It's really not that easy. Like I said, it's a tightrope. There's also, of course, the caster of the car. I like to run cars with not a lot of caster, because it's just another thing that's going to affect everything in the car, usually negatively. So if you run way too much caster, the car is going to have a lot of jacking, and there's going to be a lot of people that like jacking. I think that there's always going to be some amount of jacking. That's very simple, but I like to work with jacking with the scrub of the car. So if you say, hey, I want a little bit more jacking, run a lower offset wheel. But I'm not really crazy about achieving a lot of jacking with running more caster. I don't really like the way the car drives. It's not very smooth. It's not very predictable, especially in battles. I don't really think it's a fantastic idea. Right now I'm referring to what I would call excessive caster. So of course some jacking is of course desired in some situations. Nothing wrong with that. But I see a lot of guys that really run way too much caster, and they run way too much caster, again, as a band-aid to solve other problems. Like they may have a locate with incorrect geometry, they may have the wrong wheels on the car, they may have the wrong alignment on the car, and they're trying to solve that with a little more caster. It's also nice and easy for people to reach to that top mount. So they're on a racetrack and like, hey, I really feel like getting the toe plates out or getting under the car. I'll just loosen up those 3 bolts and give the car a little bit more caster. So it's really is a go-to thing for a lot of people. I don't think it's really good to mess with the caster too much to achieve the self-steer of the car. I think they should come from the geometry of the locket. The caster, it's also going to affect your transition quite a lot, to be honest, and it's going to flop the car to lock. So if you run a lot of caster, you're basically going to have the wheel or the tire riding on one side, so you're basically lifting the car up a little bit, and what's going to happen is that the wheel is going to affect, it's going to pull in your hands and all kinds of things. And people think like, oh, that's really nice feedback, I really like that. Well, I drove a Corvette which had a little bit too much caster. It was horrible. It was really horrible, because in the middle you really don't feel anything. So steering the car to 10 degrees, you don't feel much, and all of a sudden then it becomes extremely volatile almost, and really, really weird to drive. So it's not like that you're adding like, oh, I added a little bit of a caster and now it's going to have a little bit more self-steer throughout the whole range. That's usually never the case. What often happens is that the center becomes more shitty, and also going through the center. So in a transition, if you go from all the way to the left to all the way to the right, then you're going to have a certain spot where the car feels really unresponsive and really not nice. Whereas on the more extreme lock angles, you're going to be riding the side of the tire way more. So that's where the wheel is going to be communicating. Well, I think that's like kind of like the wrong words. It's kind of like trying to pull itself out of your hands, either to more lock or to less lock or whatever, but it's not really predictable, especially in battles where you have a lot of focus on the guy in front of you, where you're doing a million things at the same time. Like if you see yourself on GoPro footage from inside the car, There's really a lot going on in chasing, like you need to do a million things, and if the setup of the car is like kind of like weird and not natural, then that's definitely going to work against you in a battle. So that's a couple words on that. Like the Ackermann, like I said, like understand that principle of the curve, so that it's not the same. The Ackermann is never going to be the same throughout the whole range. Understand that some corners you may have to sacrifice the Ackermann setting to get a lot of profit from that in different corners. Like if you're in a situation where like, hey, everybody's running like a nitrous 2JZ with a huge turbo, and I'm the only guy running a 400 horsepower car, the way to stay on them in the bank may be to adjust your Ackermann and to set it to a reverse Ackermann even, just so you can stay with them on the bank, and your car doesn't slow down too much in chase. And yeah, for sure the car is not going to feel as nice if you go to a huge angle on the rest of the track, but that's like a strategic setup decision. With regards to the toe, you should also understand that toe and Ackermann, some things that you do to the toe settings are gonna translate the same way if you do them to the Ackermann settings. So if you drive your car like, hey, if I toe it out a little bit, it does this and that. It would also be the same in a way, like not complete. It's not like 100% the same, but like people are gonna say like, I saw Wout's video and he said like Ackermann is basically toe at lock. Well, that's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that certain principles of the toe setting of the car will also apply to changing the Ackermann. So if you have a certain feeling like, hey, if I toe out the car, it does this and that. If you work with the Ackermann and the Ackermann effect becomes stronger, it's basically possible that it does the same positive or negative things that you experience when you're towing out the car. Reversely, when you're towing in the car, you're saying like, hey, if I tow in the car a lot, that transition becomes way nicer. That's a really clear sign that you could be working on your Ackermann. Your Ackermann setting is not going to be really nice because you basically want to be running the car on zero tow or tow out. So it's always like a nice little trick if you're working on transitions and you're like, hey, what can I do? Tow the car out a little bit, tow the car in a little bit, or if you're towed out, go to neutral and see what's happening and see how that's working, and if that's affecting your transition positively or negatively, try to work with that Ackermann curve to see how that works. Again, summarizing the jacking and all that stuff that comes from the caster. So that caster can really bite you, so to speak. It really is a tightrope. So let's say that you operate between 4 and 6 degrees caster on a certain chassis. Like obviously you need to keep in mind what that car is set up in a standard way, and you really don't want to go to too much caster. Like I think that's like been a really big mistake for European drivers 10 years ago until like 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, when people really started to understand drifting suspension a little bit better in Europe. Most of those guys ran insane caster, and the reason why they did that is because they ran like homemade lock kits that really didn't help auto center the car, so they had to salvage what they could with like a cut and shot knuckle or like really weird offset arms just to make the car auto center again. And that's like really is a band-aid. And it also means that you cannot go anywhere if you set the car on anything extreme. If your car only works on extreme tow out, if your car only works on extreme Ackermann, if your car only works with extreme caster, then there's something wrong with that car. Then you need to rethink your strategy, am I using the right wheels for this car? Am I using the right shocks for this car? How's my weight distribution? Is my driving style correct for this car? Not everybody suits every car. There's a couple cars that I've driven. I'm like, well, I like the way this car drives, but it's definitely not a car I would buy myself or suits my driving style a lot. So keep all that stuff in mind, and keep in mind that there is no one answer. There's no like, hey, wow, tell us the secret, spill the beans. Sometimes people in the drift car builders forum are saying like, hey, there's guys that like kind of gatekeeping information. Well, nobody gatekeeps information. Like there's like 5 to 10% of information that I keep to myself. One reason for that may be because I think that it's really often easily misunderstood, and that's something that you don't like. And another reason can be that it's something that is experimental. So I'm like, hey, I'm kind of like working on this, I'm thinking about this, thinking about doing this, that setup. I'm not going to tell it to anybody yet because I don't know if it's actually going to work. So that's the only information that I'm withholding. For the rest, I'm like an open book. You can ask me anything, but people often are looking for a certain answer that's just not there. Saying like, what's the correct Ackermann setting for Monroe? And what do all these other guys run? But it really doesn't matter what those other guys run. Even if you take two S13, two JZ with a G-force and a quick change transmission, and both cars on Wisefab, both cars on Feal Suspension, the setting's going to be different from one driver to another. There really is no one definitive answer. It just does not exist. So keep that in mind. Also, when you're talking to pro drivers, they're usually there to help you. They're definitely not there to withhold secret information from you, like, hey, as soon as you make it to Formula Drift, there's like a secret meeting and then all the secret Ackermann things are explained. It's not there. So keep that in mind, that guys may not give you the answer that you want to hear because the answer simply doesn't exist. And stuff like Ackermann, it's so incredibly dependent on the driver and on the driver preference, but also on the power of the car, the shock setup, the wheel and tire setup. So it's something nice. It's like a nice job for you to find it out what works. It could be like a mission in your drift life, like which Ackermann setting fits me best. It's really interesting, and you're going to learn so much about car control and car setup if you're playing around with that. Definitely spend some time on that. You can also, of course, try it first on your Missile car, which is a little lower powered, so you're not going to go through that many tires and see through the principles of that Ackermann adjustment and stuff like that. You can also, like in the winter time or something, transfer the suspension from your pro car to like a Missile car, the same chassis, and work around with those settings and see. It's obviously going to be different with the pro car because it's a different car, different engine, everything. But the basic principles of the caster and camber and Ackermann, it will still like kind of translate. And the most important thing is that you'll understand the feeling of which direction you're going. So if you make a certain Ackermann change in your Missile car, which may be a 200 horsepower car, your muscle memory is not really the right word, but your brain is going to have a certain association. And when you're driving a pro car and there's a lot of stress and there's not a lot of time to make adjustments, your brain's going to be working a lot better to translate those feelings that you've learned in your Missile car, going to translate to that pro car, and you're like, hey, let's change the Ackermann a little bit, if I've got a feeling of this and that. Like your GoPros can of course also help a lot. Put a lot of GoPros on the car, in the car. I really like to put them on the B pillar, so you see both the wheel and the steering wheel at the same time, like the video we've done on Apple Valley with the Corvette. Really nice information, and you can really tell what's going on. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Comment below what you like, what you dislike. I hope the sound is okay. See you guys later.
Don't forget to take a look at our website as well, einzel.nl. We ship worldwide, of course, Wisefab, Feal Suspension, our own brand Einzel, gearboxes, quick change differentials, axles, all kinds of things. A lot of fabrication components, of course, air jacks, subframes for quick change, you name it. Drop us an email and we'll hook you up.